David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So yesterday was day one of the Republican National Convention, and I've been struggling since it ended at 11 p.m. Eastern last night to figure out really how to cover it or even talk about it. And when people do in public what many of last night's Republican speakers did at the RNC, it would lead to a 911 call and sometimes a 72-hour psych hold. I mean, that's how outrageous what we saw last night was. And in thinking how to cover it, it's sort of like, do I include a ton of clips? Do I include just a few? Do I cover every speaker or just the highlights? Do I cover the broad strokes of what the convention is doing versus the minutia of what each speaker is saying? And I don't really know the answer. So I'll just give you a few of my thoughts for today, and then we'll see tomorrow how we cover it. The theme yesterday was attack Joe Biden, but a little more specifically, it was rich people and trust fund kids telling us that Democrats are being mean to capitalism and that if Joe Biden gets elected, there's going to be some kind of a Marxist revolution in this country. And all of a sudden, the United States will be a communist dystopia. And on top of this, yesterday was riddled with identity politics. Now, it was riddled with the same identity politics that Republicans claim to be against. One of my takeaways from watching yesterday's RNC is I'm not crowbarring being Hispanic into nearly enough conversations. Yesterday, every speaker who could justify being anything other than a white person mentioned it multiple times. Don Jr.'s girlfriend, Kimberly Guilefoyle, reminding us multiple times that she's Hispanic. Nikki Haley, that she's, I believe, Native American. Tim Scott, that he's black. Vernon Jones, that he's black. I thought they were against identity politics, but I guess maybe they're only against it when it's Democrats. But clearly, if I am to take a lesson from Republicans, and why would I? But if I were to, in any opportunity that I have, I should be mentioning, by the way, I'm Hispanic. Did you know that? When I thought about yesterday's presentations in total, I thought back to that bizarre time where in 2012 at the RNC, Clint Eastwood spoke to a chair. And that was nothing. As embarrassing and humiliating as that was for Clint Eastwood, whether he recognized it or not, and I think he since said he regrets it, that was nothing 8 years ago compared to yesterday's first day of the Republican National Convention. It was really one of the most deeply dystopian events. And what made it more dystopian was the degree to which Republican voters loved it. I was looking on Twitter. I was looking in some of the recesses and cesspools of the pro-Trump internet, and people were just enamored with what they saw. So let's look at some clips. Again, I've been debating how to cover this. I think for today, I'm going to do basically one wrap-up clip, and then we'll do separate clips for specific stories as needed. So each day we'll have sort of like the main wrap up. And of course, I'm not going to be able to get to everything. If you don't like this way of covering it, just let me know and I'll look at something else. It's hours and hours of stuff, so it's very difficult to get to all of it. Now, two of the most Pyongyang, North Korea-like propaganda speeches came from Donald Trump's son, Don Jr., and Don Jr.'s girlfriend, former Fox News hostess Kimberly Guilefoyle, recently recovered, of course, from coronavirus. Now, I'm going to start with Kimberly Guilefoyle because Kimberly Guilefoyle's speech was the absolutely most outrageous thing, not just at last night's Republican National Convention, but really at any Republican National Convention that I've covered or watched. Just screaming uncontrollably, seemed like a crazy person. And I'm not using that pejoratively. She seemed out of it. She seemed ill. Take a look at this first clip.
Ladies and gentlemen, leaders and fighters for freedom and liberty and the American dream, the best is yet to come.
And then just going fully fascistic. This is the language of dictators who just project onto others what they actually want to do. Take a look at this.
They want to destroy this country and everything that we have fought for and hold dear. They want to steal your liberty, your freedom. They want to control what you see and think and believe so that they can control how you live. They want to enslave you to the weak, dependent, liberal, victim ideology to the point that you will not recognize this country or yourself.
So this was outrageous. I mean, it was, you could analyze it 5 or 6 different ways. Was it mania? Was it delusional? Was it that she chose to play a character and the character was bonkers? I just don't know. And then she was sort of almost matched in a sort of different tone and tenor by Donald Trump Jr., her partner, in full propaganda mode, essentially saying, embrace the dear leader. I mean, the shades of North Korean propaganda yesterday couldn't be missed. Take a look at Don Jr. here.
Imagine the life you want to have. One with a great job, a beautiful home, a perfect family. You can have it. Imagine the country you want to live in. One with true equal opportunity, where hard work pays off and justice is served with compassion and without partiality. You can have it. Imagine a world where the evils of communism and radical Islamic terrorism are not given a chance to spread, where heroes are celebrated and the good guys win. You can have it. That is the life. That is the country. That is the world that Donald Trump and the Republican Party are after. And yes, you can have it. Because unlike Joe Biden and the radical left Democrats, our party is open to everyone.
Everything you want can be given to you by Donald Trump and Donald Trump only. But notice, it's not going to happen in 4 years. It's going to take Trump 8 years to give you everything. Nobody else can do it. And Trump also couldn't do it in 4 years, which is why he needs another 4 to give you all of these things. Anytime that you hear this one man can give you everything stuff, and we heard it in 2016 when Trump would say, only I can fix it. That's an authoritarian red flag. Likewise, the projection was just off the wall. Kimberly Guilefoyle projecting onto Joe Biden the authoritarianism, which is actually the hallmark of Donald Trump. And then they brought out a Cuban American named Maximo Alvarez. And as I've mentioned before on the program, as a Hispanic American myself, remember, if the RNC has taught me anything, it's I need to constantly talk about how I'm Hispanic. The only Latin American group in the United States that has any significant amount of conservatism is Cuban Americans. All other Latino groups are overwhelmingly liberal in the United States. They brought out a Cuban American, Maximo Alvarez, who equated Joe Biden to Fidel Castro, if you can imagine. Take a look.
Speaking to you today because I have seen people like this before. I've seen movements like this before. I've seen ideas like this before. And I am here to tell you, we cannot let them take over our country. I heard the promises of Fidel Castro, and I can never forget all those who grew up around me, who look like me, who suffered and starved and died because they believed those empty promises.
Now, anybody who has any connection to reality would know that there is no similarity between center-left Joe Biden, who's been pulled a little bit further to the left over the last 3 months. There's nothing linking him to Fidel Castro, nor to Venezuelan leaders Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro. But the constant imagery yesterday linking Biden to Venezuela, linking Biden to Cuba, to socialism, to Marxism. Meanwhile, the progressive left is disappointed that Biden isn't really that progressive. I mean, it's just a fantasy world that this convention was based on. Now, I don't want to give the next two people too much attention because it's borderline criminal that they're even part of the Republican National Convention. But the McCloskeys, this is the couple from St. Louis who brandished firearms at Black Lives Matter protesters. They were invited to speak. This is a couple, they're lawyers, who are known only for pointing long guns, or I think it was one long gun and a handgun, at protesters in St. Louis a few weeks ago. They spoke. I'm only going to give you 5 seconds of them. I'm just refusing to give you more. Here is, I believe it's Patricia McCloskey, the wife, saying that Joe Biden wants to end the suburbs.
To abolish the suburbs altogether by ending single-family home zoning.
It's really an indictment of everything that these people were even speakers at the convention, and then finishing out the Joe Biden will abolish stuff phase of our review. Here is Natalie Harp claiming that Joe Biden would essentially abolish doctors. People wouldn't be able to have doctors anymore if Joe Biden were president.
God forbid what the next 4 years would look like. For in Joe Biden's America, China would control our drug production. We'd be one step closer to government-run health care. We wouldn't just be unable to keep our doctors. We'd be lucky if we could see any doctor.
We would be lucky if we could see any doctor under Joe Biden, says Natalie Harp. Now, there were many more speakers. Quite frankly, I don't think I can tolerate too much more. But the themes were claim that there was no policy discussed at the DNC and then don't talk about any policy. Disparage the DNC as being just about criticizing Trump, but then spend the entire time merely criticizing Joe Biden as a Marxist and a communist. And I'm truly questioning, number one, the future of this country if 60 million people see this and then vote for it in November. And number two, whether I'm actually going to be able to make it through 3 more days of this garbage. I'm going to try. But this was truly, I mean, this isn't healthy. This is really bad. This is very, very bad. And then to top it off, here is my absolute favorite moment from day one of the RNC. Donald Trump staged these little conversations with different, at one point it was with workers, at another point it was with former hostages. The idea was to put Trump in front of people and make him seem like a relatable, normal guy. And at one point, one of the workers that was part of the group that Trump was speaking to said, I'm a custodian at a school. Trump doesn't know what a custodian is. It's just the epitome of privilege, where anybody who went to public school or even to private school and was just like enmeshed in what was going on, you would know the custodian cleans the school. It's not like Trump maybe thinks a financial custodian of assets or something. The worker says, I'm a custodian. Trump says, oh, and what do you do? As if, I'm dropping everything because this is so crazy. Take a look at it.
How about you?
I'm a custodian at the post office as well.
What do you do exactly?
Clean up everybody's mess and everybody's germs and all that.
Can I tell you that world, that profession will never be out of business. You know that, right?
Sure.
Just a microcosm of the entire Republican National Convention day one. Rich people and trust fund babies claiming to be all about workers and the middle class, and fear mongering that Joe Biden will make us Marxist while knowing absolutely nothing about the middle class and workers. So tonight we go on to day 2. Everything is always scheduled, but could change. Tonight it's Melania Trump, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Senator Rand Paul, that Covington kid Nick Sandmann, Eric Trump, and Tiffany Trump. I will see you tonight, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time on YouTube and Twitch. So now that the Republican National Convention is underway, which will include the formal renomination of Donald Trump as the Republican nominee for president, accepting formally, whoa, my chair almost just fell, accepting formally on Thursday, something stunning is going on. The Republican Party is surrendering to whatever the hell Trump wants. And Republicans have announced they are not going to be adopting any platform at this week's convention. Instead, they're saying, we support Trump. Now, some of you may know, if you've seen conventions before, it's not only typical, but it's really one of the key things that is done at a convention, which is that the candidate is nominated, but platforms for the party are voted on and established. They're updated. Every 4 years, the platform is modified as makes sense. 4 years of stuff has happened. Now, what is really hilarious is that Republicans are saying, because of the social distancing stuff, because we're doing everything safely, we're just not going to do any kind of platform update. And we're essentially pledging allegiance to whatever the hell Donald Trump wants. Now, there's something very interesting and specific to this year. Policy and platforms are a problem when Donald Trump is your nominee, because you've had 4 years of doing absolutely nothing, and in some cases supporting ideas that run counter to much of what the Republican Party actually has stood for on paper. So Republicans have decided we're just not going to unveil a new platform, period. And hilariously, they're saying that it's because the event is scaled back that they're not going to do it. The truth is, if they wanted to unveil a new platform, there's nothing stopping them from doing it. It's the speeches that have to be scaled back, or at least the crowds, the audiences, the in-person stuff. But a new platform could be developed. It could be unveiled regardless of the format. And instead, the Republican Party is pledging to, quote, enthusiastically support the president's America First agenda. This, of course, is extremely unusual. And even some Republicans are saying that the party is essentially abandoning its values, abandoning its principles in order to support Donald Trump. And that is indeed exactly what they are doing. I mean, the Republicans willing to say that are correct. They've completely abandoned all of their stated values, and they're just saying whatever Trump wants, he gets. Elected Republicans and the Republican Party are descending into the same cultish behavior that Trump's followers have fallen into. And this is typical of authoritarians around the world. We talked earlier about Don Jr.'s speech, where it's Trump alone can fix it. Trump is you just have to follow and support Trump. Policy is irrelevant. All that matters is everybody get in line and support the dear leader. And it's another step in the direction of authoritarianism, where there is no tolerance for critical questions. The group leader is always right. The way to know the truth is to ask the leader, what does the leader think? And the other thing Republicans are probably too dumb or too distracted to realize is that by not changing their 2016 platform, they are conceding that Trump has accomplished nothing. And I'll put it a different way to make it really clear. They claim, and Trump claims, that he is the most accomplished president in history. They say, and Trump says about himself, I've done more in my first term than any president in history. And yet their plan for the next 4 years is the same as for the last 4 years. If the plan is the same, you didn't do the things you said you were going to do. If you succeeded, you would want a different list of things for the next 4 years. It's all incoherent. And I'm obviously trying to apply logic where there is no logic, but this is fundamentally a cult that now extends to the Republican Party itself, of people who are either too afraid to go against Donald Trump or simply don't care as long as they own the libs. And so they're going to scrap their platform, put aside everything they claim to stand for, and let Trump ramble for 4 nights in a possibly, just historically laughable and humiliating Republican National Convention. And important, always, he could get another 4 years. If we don't act to prevent it, he could end up with another 4 years. Make sure you're following me on Twitter @dpacman, and make sure you're getting the daily audio podcast on whatever is your favorite podcasting platform.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Amy Hickman and Teresha Miller. Thanks to Amy and Teresha, and also a big thank you to Robert Peterson, who's today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Robert's been a member, like many others, almost 5 years. You can join these great people by signing up in under a minute at joinpakman.com. And yes, membership does come with access to the world famous daily bonus show. It's an extra show every day just for our members. Here's an interesting story that has some people on the left sort of upset or certainly at least concerned. On August 17th, about 8 days ago, the Democratic National Committee removed language from a draft platform, a draft document calling for an end to subsidies of fossil fuel companies. And the Democratic National Committee and Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris historically have opposed fossil fuel subsidies. They've said they would end them, and it was in a draft document. And yet 8 days ago, the call for the end to these fossil fuel subsidies was quietly removed. Why did it happen? It's not completely clear, but there was huge backlash. A lot of climate activists saw it as a stab in the back. Many people alleged that, look, this is Joe Biden. He said he was going to do one thing, and then they quietly remove it from the document. And now all of a sudden, they're no longer against abolishing fossil fuel subsidies, which cost somewhere between $20 and $650 billion each year, depending on what you include and how you measure it. And a bunch of people reacted by saying, this exposes the true Biden. Biden doesn't really want to do the things he claims he wants to do on climate or on whatever else. And it's sort of Biden showing his true colors. Now, after the backlash, it's been added back in. And again, it has been restated that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the DNC support ending subsidies to fossil fuel companies. And of course, the reaction from many was, and it's not a crazy reaction, Joe Biden doesn't really support it, but he only got shamed back into it right now. So you could chalk this up to confusion. You could chalk it up to a misunderstanding. You could chalk it up to bad faith. I have to tell you, it seems unlikely to me that what happened here is that they really were trying to just remove this pledge to end fossil fuel subsidies, and they got caught and they put it back in. The way the DNC operates is if they want to back away from some kind of promise, they do it and they come up with flowery or non-offensive language to defend it. So I actually think it's more likely that this was some kind of a confusion or a misunderstanding. But I think it's instructive in that it sort of reinforces something I've been talking about for a while, which is if Joe Biden wins, we are getting the ball back. We are not yet putting any points up on the board, to use a sort of football analogy. And we're going to have to push Joe Biden if he's president. And we're going to have to push him for the entire time that he is president. So I'm not hugely worried about this for two reasons. Number one, I actually do think it was probably some kind of a mistake or misunderstanding, because this is not how the DNC would probably do this. Also, more than likely, if they didn't plan to end fossil fuel subsidies or even try to, they would just leave it in, but then just not do it and blame Republicans. So I think that that's probably not the explanation. But either way, we are going to have to, as progressive activists, hold Joe Biden accountable if we want to get things done and put points on the board if he indeed becomes president of the United States. So I don't think this was some kind of deliberate betrayal by Joe Biden. His campaign seems to have been clear the whole time. And by the way, I have to tell you something else. On this particular issue of ending fossil fuel subsidies, it's going to be difficult to do in 4 years. It's going to be difficult to do maybe even in 8 years. It should be done. We should be shifting subsidies away from fossil fuels and to renewables. But in practice, it's going to be difficult to do. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but part of being able to do it is going to be getting off of these fuels in the first place. And it is kind of a chicken egg scenario. As we continue to be dependent on fossil fuels, it will be difficult to remove the subsidies. And if we remove the subsidies, it'll be difficult to get off of them because the prices of fossil fuels will be kept artificially low by the subsidies themselves. But it's going to have to be a sort of step by step by step. But the hot takes that are saying this is proof of Biden this, or this is proof of Biden that. Joe Biden's climate proposal would be the most progressive of any president if Biden wins. And either way, we are going to have to hold him accountable. And that will be the mission of progressive media. I hope that's what I'm anticipating my job to be for the next 4 or 8 years if Joe Biden succeeds at removing Donald Trump in November. This is a super interesting peek behind the curtain. There are now multiple reports out that privately, Donald Trump Jr. believes that Donald Trump is going to lose in November and lose badly. And fascinatingly, Don Jr. reportedly believes that not only Donald Trump, but Don Jr. and maybe other members of the family are going to be indicted and prosecuted if Donald Trump loses in November. This is so interesting in terms of what it says about their realization about what's going on, despite always claiming everything is great. So the New York Times has an interesting piece about this where they quote a prominent conservative activist who was interviewed on the condition of anonymity, who told the New York Times that Don Jr. thinks they're going to lose in November, and that when they lose, they're going to get, quote, really hurt, meaning that federal prosecutions of not just Donald Trump, but of his family and political allies may be an inevitability. And according to the same conservative activist, Don Jr. believes that a Biden administration will not peacefully transition, but they will instead shoot the prisoners, was the term that Don Jr. used, although that particular piece was later denied by Andy Surabian, who's another Republican operative. So there's a few different things here. First, let's deal with the prosecution. You could say, if you're innocent, you don't fear being prosecuted. That's fair, but it's really easy to counter in this particular case, because if you believe that there will be politically motivated, partisan political attacks, you could take the position that the next administration will prosecute you, not because you committed crimes, but as political payback. Now, there's, of course, no evidence of that. If Joe Biden wins and there are prosecutions of the Trump family, it would be because there's evidence that they committed crimes, not because of some personal vendetta by Joe Biden. But for me, the more important revelation is about Donald Trump's desperation to win. If Don Jr. really believes that there's a risk of prosecution if Joe Biden wins in November, that must be at least somewhat in Donald Trump's mind, at least a little bit. And it would explain Donald Trump's willingness to do anything to win in November. And we've talked about this before. Donald Trump may genuinely believe that he must win in November to avoid prosecution. I actually don't think it's likely. I think the Trump organization will be gone after for financial crimes and it won't touch Trump personally. But if Trump thinks it's a possibility, he is like a cornered animal. That's the analogy we've been using. And cornered animals behave erratically. That tells us why Trump will use the post office and try to suppress vote by mail and try to close polling places and contest the election results and call it rigged and welcome foreign interference, because Trump may see this not just as fighting for his political life and his reputation as he may see it, but as the way to keep himself out of prison or at least out of a courtroom for the rest of his life. Now, just imagine, for the sake of following this, imagine if Biden wins and makes Hillary Clinton attorney general. And imagine that she oversees prosecution of the Trump family when it was Trump in 2016 running on lock her up. I don't deny that there would be something interesting about that, but let's put it aside here and not really put the cart before the horse. The real takeaway is that a cornered animal will lash out in ways that are incredibly dangerous and violent. And that's what we have to expect over the next 10 weeks here. It is 10 weeks to the day today until November 3rd. Now, my real concern is that Trump won't lose in November, and that, I can't exactly put my finger on it, but over the last 2 weeks, I've started to lean closer to thinking a Trump reelection is more likely than it was a couple weeks ago. Polling might be a part of it. Polling has certainly tightened a little bit. In late June, Biden was averaging plus 10 nationally. Now Biden is averaging plus 7.5. So that's part of it. But there's something intangible that I can't quite put my finger on that has me more worried today about a Trump reelection than I was 2 to 3 weeks ago. Let me know what you think it might be. We'll have more on this on the David Pakman Show Instagram page at David Pakman Show. While you're there, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It is great to welcome back to the program today Dr. Isaac Bogoch, who's an infectious disease physician and scientist based out of the University of Toronto and Toronto General Hospital. Always great to talk to you.
Oh, nice to see you again.
So I guess just to start with briefly, we're seeing the U.S. number of coronavirus cases down from their sort of second peak, still around 40,000 cases a day. I know you're in Canada. I don't know how closely you're following the ins and outs of case numbers here, but there's some skepticism about whether these case numbers can be trusted at this point, given a lot of different things that have gone on with the data, with testing pause due to weather events, and so many other things. My question to you is there really a better metric to pay attention to at this point, be it hospitalizations or deaths or something else?
In all fairness, I look at a combination of metrics. I think the number of new cases per day is very, very helpful. But above and beyond that, I look at other metrics as well. I look at the 7-day average. I look at the number of tests that are performed. I look at the percentage of tests that are positive out of the number of tests that are performed. And I really think that when we sort of combine all of those metrics and more, we really paint a more holistic picture that gives us a better understanding. Of course, if testing isn't being done, it's hard to know exactly what the ground truth is. But in all fairness, I think it's by this point in time, we sort of know in most regions how things are going and what direction things are turning, either for better or for worse.
So one specific question on testing and positivity. Sometimes we will see a situation where it looks like in a particular state, cases have gone down. And then when you look in a little more detail, you see that tests are down 30%. And new cases are only down 10%, which implies a higher positivity rate. And it suggests that it's because you're doing less testing that cases have gone down. The counterpoint is, well, you know, if the testing goes down, you're probably only testing sicker people. So it makes sense that the positivity rate would go up. It doesn't necessarily mean there are actually more cases out there. Is there any way to know for sure?
Well, yes, there is. And the real answer is getting lots of disparate data sources together in one place. And really, that is why it is so important to look at several metrics rather than just relying on a handful of metrics. And then, of course, watching the metrics through time. An individual day or even a few days really does nothing to us. It's really important to look at longer term trends, 7-day trends and beyond. And I think if we're starting to do that and stop reacting to, terms like uptick and downtick every time we see some variation in the data, we'll be in a much better place. There's going to be the expected normal variations on a day-to-day basis and even maybe on a bit of a longer term basis. But if we look at weekly trends and look at multiple data sources, I think we'll be in the right place. And really, truly, all of those combined together gives us a good impression. I don't think anyone following this is really looking at that, one true metric that's really going to provide all the answers. It's a multitude of metrics.
So let's talk about the next 3 to 4 months. Some of the countries that did successfully flatten their curves are starting to see some more cases. Spain is one example that I've been looking at, and there are many others. In the United States, when we first got down to 20,000 cases a day, things just basically reopened and we went all the way back up to 75. Now we're back down to 40. What is the best assessment now of what was originally thought of in the May projections to be a discrete second wave, which now is just maybe going to be a kind of continuation? What is the timing looking like? How bad could it potentially get?
It's interesting because we talk about the second wave like it has some finite definition. And in all fairness, I don't think it really matters whether or not this is a spike in the first wave, a plateau in the first wave, a distinct second wave. I think a lot of this is irrelevant in the sense that, number one, you still have a very susceptible population, meaning that, in most places, the vast majority of people have not had this infection, so are susceptible to getting this infection. And number two, if you don't have controls in place to keep this infection at bay, you're going to see widespread transmission. So, if we look in the crystal ball, we can predict what's going to happen. If people are in indoor environments in close proximity for prolonged periods of time, we know that this is the perfect setup for transmission. Now, let's think about what's going to happen in the months ahead. At least in the northern parts of the United States, it's going to get cool. We've got kids going back to school. We've got many people going back to work in person. We've got cooler temperatures that are driving us inside. We've got economies that are opening. And all of those just put people together in indoor environments for prolonged periods of time. That is where this virus is transmitted. If we take steps to mitigate that, spread people apart, put a mask on when you go inside, limit the number of people in indoor settings, we can probably do a decent job in mitigating the spread. But I still think we'll probably see a rise in cases, at least in the northern part of the United States and certainly in Canada as we enter the fall and winter months.
So in terms of masks, obviously there's been a lot about masks over the last many months. In particular, there is disagreement, I guess we can say, about the degree to which masks prevent transmission and whether they're really to protect one from spreading versus to protect one from catching, or both. There's a very popular meme that's been floating around, which, it puts numbers to it, where it says, if both people wear a mask, it's like a 1% chance of transmission. If one person wears a mask, it's 5%. If neither one does, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure those aren't the right numbers, but are there any numbers or specificity to the effect of masks? And then, of course, what type of mask, I'm guessing, is a factor as well.
Right. I think we can talk about this in general principles. And I certainly, just full disclosure, masks is probably my least favorite topic of this epidemic or pandemic.
Interesting.
For whatever reason, this was like the hot button issue. This was politicized to such a degree. People have very, very strong opinions on many different sides of the equation. People are cherry picking data to suit their preconceived ideas. And it's really frustrating when you really want to just take a public health look at this, an epidemiologic look at it, a medical and scientific look at it. It's kind of frustrating. And quite frankly, it's frustrating because people who should know better are still, I think, speaking beyond the data or still cherry picking data. Having said that, there are many rational voices, both in the lay community and in the medical, scientific, and public health community. And I commend those people, because anytime we talk about this, for whatever reason, there seems to be a dog pile effect. Now, let's get to the question. So in general, based on what we know now, we can talk about masks at an individual level, and we can also talk about masks at a population level. I think we can also talk about masks in a healthcare specific area as well. But in general, at an individual level, if you put a mask on and you're infected, you're just going to reduce the amount of virus that you transmit to the environment around you. Seems to make sense. Pretty good idea. Now, does this pan out at a population level? It's interesting. There's modeling studies, which, quite frankly, I work in epidemiology as well. And, a lot of my career is based on working with modeling and whatnot. I've got to say, I should be the big supporter of models. I think models are helpful, but I don't think they really answer definitively the questions that we want to answer. They're helpful, they're useful, but we have to take a lot of the modeling data with a grain of salt. So at an individual level, great. I think it's a no-brainer. We've known this long before COVID-19. If you put on a mask, you just reduce the amount of virus you're going to shed in the environment around you. At a population level, the waters get a bit murkier. Will it really help at a population level if there's masking? Yeah, you know what? At the end of the day, if we sift through the data, it probably helps, but I think it helps to a much smaller extent than what many people might believe or might want to believe. But I'm not saying it doesn't help. I think it does. And then, how do you take this data and translate into policy? I think at the end of the day, we also know where this virus is transmitted. It's almost, well, I shouldn't say exclusively, but it's truly an indoor virus. There's just remarkably few transmissions of this virus that are credible, that have been documented in outdoor settings. Sure, it can happen in an outdoor setting, but it's just not nearly as common as indoor settings. So if we take our data that we have with masks, with the total appreciation that this is imperfect data, with the total appreciation that it's going to be impossible to, at this point, to have a perfect randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial or whatever we want to design. But if we take the existing data that we have, I think it's very reasonable to translate that into policy to say, listen, if you're in an indoor setting, you should put on a mask. I think it's as simple as that. Outdoors, I've seen some of the narratives coming out of the United States with people saying, I went for a 20K jog and I had a mask on my whole time and this didn't bother me one bit. Mazel tov, we're all very proud of you for wearing a mask, but like, I don't think you're at risk of transmitting this infection if you're on a 20K jog and you probably don't need to wear a mask. I'd focus on indoor settings. I think masks are a great idea. Taking the politics out of it, we should be putting on a mask when we go indoors.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this. We'll move on after this. But here in Boston now, if you're just even walking downtown, if you don't have a mask on, people kind of look at you. From the studies I've looked at, it really doesn't seem like that is at all a high risk scenario. But if people want to do it, like you said, Mazel Tov, l'chaim, I'll do it. I'll do it in order to participate because I don't want to be the person who's not participating. But it doesn't really seem to be based too much in the science.
I think you have a really good point there. And a lot of this bleeds well out of science and medicine and into more sociological or socio-political conversation. I'm sitting here in Toronto. I cannot comment, I cannot empathize on what you're going through in the United States in terms of the degree of politicization that this has had. And if the mask might also represent a lot more than, hey, I'm here to keep you safe in case I'm infected. And I appreciate that there's a lot more going on in the United States with regards to that than there is in Canada. It might be a signal that I align with this particular group or that I have these particular beliefs. And in all fairness, I'm not into shaming and blaming. People want to wear a mask, go for it, wear a mask. But like, where I would be more of a stickler about it is in indoor settings. I think it's important that people put them on when they go inside. I think that will actually have some utility in preventing the transmission of this infection.
Okay, so vaccines, multiple vaccine candidates, on spec production of a number of them so that if indeed we learn this one is a go or that one is a go, doses will be available. Makes perfect sense. Russia claims to have a vaccine, which has a number of questions around it. At this point, my thought has been the optimistic scenario is somewhere around October 15. There's an announcement made that a vaccine is safe and at least gives 4 or 5 months of immunity. It starts to be rolled out slowly. Healthcare workers, maybe by the end of the year, 2021, high-risk populations. Is that still the optimistic scenario? Where are we on vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, the pace of vaccine development is just staggering. This is phenomenal. There's about 24 that are in human clinical trials. Remember, we didn't know this infection existed 7 months ago. And now, 7 months in, you've got just over 24 in human clinical trials. I think right now there's 6 or 7 that are in what's called phase 3 human clinical studies. Like, that's amazing. I mean, that's where you're enrolling thousands and thousands and thousands of people to answer the question, does it work? And is it safe? So, there's tremendous pace. And of course, we know many of these vaccines are going to fail, but there's so many that are in development and even in advanced stages of development that I'm with you. I do share that optimistic outlook that we'll probably have some successful trials before the end of 2020. I wouldn't be surprised if needles start going in arms before the end of 2020. Hey, I could be totally wrong. I could be way off, and it could be 2021, and these might be a bust. But looking at the data that we have available to us, it's pretty promising. It's not, nothing, of course, is guaranteed, but I share that view. I also like that concept where many governments, or I guess in partnership with the companies, just say, you know what, let's just mass produce these vaccines now. We appreciate that we might be tossing $1 billion out the window if it doesn't work, but the ones that do work, we can already start to roll out vaccine programs. Like, that's a really smart idea. If you've got money to burn, that's a great way to spend it. Because I think at the end of the day, when you balance the economics, lost versus gained, I think this will likely side towards a net gain. I'm not a health economics type of guy, but I'm pretty sure that that's the way the tables will turn, or at least whatever the word, you know what I'm trying to say.
Now, when it starts to become available, it takes a while before we really get towards being able to say we have ended the pandemic, right? I mean, it's when you took my understanding is with something as contagious as coronavirus, about 70% immunity is required for herd. 40% of the US is not even interested in getting the vaccine, which is a totally different story. But once the vaccine rolls out, it's still going to be a while, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think this pandemic's going to end with a bang, but more with a whimper, right? It's probably going to peter out as more and more people get vaccinated, or as more and more people get this infection and then recover from it and have some degree of immunity for some period of time. So it's probably going to peter out. I think the other thing that it's not talked about a lot is, even though we'll have access to this vaccine in many high-income countries, this pandemic is still going to be raging in many other parts of the world, especially in low-income countries that sadly are, might not have the same access to the vaccine that you and I will have. And I think there's going to be a lot of individuals, a significant proportion of the globe, that will be suffering, disproportionately suffering, because of limited access to the vaccine, because many of the high-income countries are buying it all up and snatching it all up. And I really hope, I know that there are programs, I know the WHO is looking into this, and there are groups looking into this to really have more equitable vaccine programs worldwide. But part of me is a little bit skeptical as to how successful those will be.
We're going to go to a break on the podcast and radio show with Dr. Isaac Bogoch, but our full conversation will be on the YouTube channel.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So I have a few different absolutely crazy things to catch you up on relating to one of Donald Trump's closest advisors, Kellyanne Conway. Kellyanne has announced that she's going to be leaving the White House at the end of the month, meaning in just a few days, because of a need to, quote, focus on the family. Now, if you're not aware, Kellyanne Conway has been just a disgusting Trump sycophant for years, but she happens to be married to George Conway, who is an anti-Trump Republican and who, in fact, has become one of the loudest anti-Trump Republican voices on the internet and part of this anti-Trump Republican coalition called the Lincoln Project. Well, in the middle of all this, their daughter, Claudia Conway, became an outspoken anti-Trump personality online. Clearly, things are really bad for the family. And so Kellyanne Conway has now announced that she's leaving the White House. George Conway is leaving the Lincoln Project and leaving Twitter. And it seems that this clearly is the right move for them as a family. And part of the constant dysfunction of the Trump White House has just bled over and is ruining so many people's lives. And clearly, the decision made by the Conway parents must in part be because of the insanity that their children have been pulled into. Kellyanne Conway putting out a statement saying about her and her husband that, quote, "We disagree about plenty, but we are united on what matters most, the kids. Our 4 children are teens and tweens starting a new academic year in the middle school and high school that will be conducted remotely from home for at least a few months. As millions of parents nationwide know, kids doing school from home requires a level of attention and vigilance that is as unusual as these times. This is completely my choice and my voice. In time, I will announce future plans. For now and for my beloved children, it will be less drama and more mama." Their daughter, Claudia, also tweeted over the weekend that she was going to be taking a break from Twitter. And listen, this all is a horrible situation. But in the middle of this, their daughter, in a now deleted video, also accused Kellyanne Conway of physical abuse. And again, that video has since been deleted. There have been notable Twitter exchanges between mom and daughter. For example, when Kellyanne tweeted about Herman Cain, quote, "Herman Cain led a remarkable life and will be missed. He loved his family, the country, and the Lord. He triumphed in business, beat cancer, and was a voice for freedom. God bless you and yours, Herman." Her daughter, Claudia Conway, responded, "Yes, it is sad, but wasn't your administration complicit in his death? Yikes." So here's the bottom line. I don't know if Kellyanne Conway abused her daughter. I don't know anything about that. This is clearly a family in struggle. It should be up to them to figure out what's best for the family. I'm less interested in the gossip element and more interested in the theme, which is that everything Trump touches turns to manure. How many lives, and I'm not talking about, you can talk about millions of lives have been ruined by Donald Trump's presidency in terms of financial repercussions or the friends and relatives of the people who died of coronavirus who didn't have to. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying people who work for Trump, the people Trump brings around him, the number of ruined lives, people arrested, people fired, people becoming global laughingstocks. Kellyanne Conway is the 557th person to leave the Trump administration since the beginning. Trump's sister has been recorded recently saying horrible things about Trump. Trump's niece wrote a devastating book about him. Melania is now reportedly recorded saying horrible things about Trump and his own children, which I'll talk about next. We just need a normal presidency and a normal president. And as I tweeted a couple of days ago, and it seemed to resonate with a lot of people, Joe Biden's presidency, if we get one, would probably be one of the most boring in a very long time. And that's perfectly fine with me. Now, as parents, it does seem the Conways realize that this public battle where they've been on opposite sides of this presidency has been terrible for their family and their kids. That's good. I guess it's better that they recognize that now instead of in another 6 months, we could say. But it would have been far better for them to recognize that 3.5 years ago. Let's now talk about the Melania revelations. So everything is just falling apart for Donald Trump. Not only did his niece write a horrifying book about him, not only did his sister get caught on leaked audio slamming him, but now there are reports that Donald Trump's own wife, Melania Trump, the first lady, has been caught on tape making disparaging comments about both Donald Trump himself and his children. The recording has been reportedly made by Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, who's a former advisor to Melania, and she's going to be putting out a book in September called Melania and Me, The Rise and Fall of My Friendship with the First Lady. Now, this is essentially gossip in a sense, but it's gossip that goes to the same story. Trump doesn't have normal relationships. He's not a normal person. Many of the people around him are around him not just because they enjoy it, but for who knows what kinds of other reasons. And much like he ruins personal relationships, he ruins our relationship as a country with our allies. He's just ruining everything that he touches. Now, the book will eventually have the details. It'll be released in September. Presumably audio will also be released. But reportedly, Melania Trump in these recordings attacks Ivanka Trump. I guess Melania really doesn't like Ivanka, and attacks Donald Trump himself and attacks Trump's other adult children. So this is really just a reality show. And again, as I said just a few minutes ago in the last story, I look forward to and would welcome gladly a boring Biden presidency and things just being boring for a while Donald Trump is gone. Now, this is the same advisor to Melania, by the way, writing this book, that told Melania, remember when they came up with that be best thing? And it sounded just like a grammatical mistake. This same advisor to Melania, who reportedly recorded Melania disparaging Trump and his children, told Melania that her be best slogan sounded illiterate, which it does. I mean, it sounds illiterate. And it also sounds potentially plagiarized, which I'm actually less sure about. If nothing else, removing this and putting the Biden family in the White House, it would just be a breath of fresh air to just make this garbage stop. Boring presidency, I welcome. And I can tell you, boring won't be particularly good for my business, but who cares? It'll be good for the country. A scandal a day, white knuckling it with some new scandal every single week. It really is exhausting. Now, to be clear, Biden being boring doesn't mean we stop paying attention if Biden wins. It doesn't mean we stop lobbying for progressive change. It just means the process gets back to one of being mildly connected to how modern Western democracies are supposed to operate. Now, of course, if Biden is president, Fox News will find scandals. They will fabricate scandals. They will concoct scandals if they need to, but they will be similar to Obama wore a tan suit. Obama's choice of mustard was arrogant or whatever. The other side to this is that there will be so much damage to clean up, and most likely a Biden presidency will be dealing with at least 6 months of Trump continuing to be triggered constantly by Biden starting to undo the damage Trump has done. Joe Biden will still be dealing with a pandemic. Nothing is fixed if Biden becomes president. It gives us the ball back, to use that analogy again, and we can start to fix things. We'll still have the pandemic. The economic recovery from Trump's mishandling of the pandemic is likely to take all of Joe Biden's first term if he were to get one. But just for context, and I know that this is crazy to think back to, there were periods of time during Barack Obama's presidency where we didn't cover Obama even for an entire week, never mind every day. Like, there were times when the president just did their job and we talked about other things, what was going on in the Senate, geopolitics, and much else, because there wasn't constantly some fire to be putting out. They seem like simpler times in some ways. Now, back to the recordings of Melania slamming Trump briefly. It really would be great if they were released this week during the RNC. Just a thought. Trump would fly off the rails, and I would love to see it. Let me know if anybody else is thinking along the same lines. We have a voicemail number which you can call anytime. The number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a call from a guy who is very happily voting Trump. Take a listen.
I am voting for President Trump.
By the way, the requisite show playing in the background. It's always it's a staple of these phone calls.
And no, you can sit up there and lie all you want to. I am voting for President Trump, the best president that ever lived. God bless you, and thank you.
Right. So remember, you can't talk a guy out of that in the 10 weeks we have left. Don't even bother. We just have to get the vote out. Remember that. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about reports of New York City's demise being greatly exaggerated. We will talk about differences in coverage of the conventions on corporate media and much, much more. Make sure to get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpacman.com or a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.